everyone. My name is Lee St. James. I'm the Managing Director of the Urban Robotics Foundation, and I'm thrilled to welcome you today to our webinar, Preparing for Robots in Public Through an Urban Planner's Lens. Our host today is our Global Head of Urban Planning, Adam Beck, and I'm going to hand it over to him now. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, Lee, thank you for that introduction, and indeed welcome everyone. I'm dialing in from Brisbane, Queensland, in Australia. It has just gone midnight, but I think that's a better position than being on vacation, as one of our guests, Viggy Ram, is at the moment. And a big thank you to Viggy to joining as he multitasks with other vacation-related issues. And John Jung from Toronto. Thanks so much. John is chairman and co-founder of the ICF, the Intelligent Community Forum. For those that don't know, make sure you follow John on LinkedIn. And likewise, Viggy is vice president public policy at Serve Robotics. Both individuals I've engaged with before, and really looking forward to sharing some questions with them, and of course, the responses being part of a dialogue that we have together in this session. Just a couple of introductory items, acknowledging that some of you may not know or have heard of the Urban Robotics Foundation. We've been around for a little while, headquartered out of Toronto. We've got boots on the ground in some various places, and we think that urban robotics is a catalyst for sustainability, for social equity, and a lot of economic development opportunity. We think they are good. And one of the reasons why we think urban planning and urban design is a really important profession and indeed sector to engage in this agenda. Some of the work that we've done relates to the development of resources, sharing of case studies, development of use cases, and public area mobile robots, PMRs, as we call them, take many different shapes and forms, and sometimes, based on what's in the media, we can certainly conjure up just particular types of PMRs, but there's actually a lot of applications and use cases that we find that are beneficial to cities and communities, and you'll find that in some of our work online. If you head to urbanroboticsfoundation.org. One of those resources that you'll find there, which certainly I'd encourage everyone to download and take a glance at some time. And indeed, this resource is sort of the backbone and the catalyst for this webinar. And this document is Robots in Public. It was a partnership between a number of organizations, ASTM International, Mass Robotics, NIST was a supporter, and URF had some contributions. And indeed, Chapter 6, I had the honor of helping scribe and pen some thoughts in that chapter around what PMRs might mean from an urban planning perspective, and we're going to unpack some of those today. So with that, I've got John, I've got Viggy, I've got myself, and more importantly, I've got you as the audience to keep us going for the next 55 minutes. And I'm gonna jump in, and Viggy, I'm going to start with you. You are Serve boots on the ground in many cities now around the world. And I feel like 2026 is the year where we can kind of say that we've moved beyond pilot and we're scaling, even though we are still piloting. But this is no longer science fiction. This is scaling in cities. As an urban planner, I wanted to ask you an urban planning question. Knowing what you know now in the cities that you've deployed, I'd love to get a sense from you as to what you wish planners had set up before Serve coming to cities, or what engagement with planners, or indeed what the planning profession could have sort of supported in the way of PMR deployments in cities. So it's a bit of a look back question, now that you've deployed in many places. What have you learnt, and what do you wish planning had brought to some of those experiences earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have sort of two different answers to this. First, thank you to the Urban Robotics Foundation for having us here and to be able to speak about our experiences in deploying delivery robots, across the United States and starting to go international this year. One of the interesting sort of challenges that I think local planners, municipal regulators have encountered is being able to distinguish between fleet management and like a centralized managed fleet and a disaggregated fleet. I think this is one of those challenges between car share, ride share, or e-scooter programs, which are often kind of brought up as the closest analog to delivery robots, and delivery robots or AVs, in which case there's a central fleet manager. And one of the advantages of having a central fleet manager is you can make fixes very, very quickly. Geofences will be adhered to. That when it comes from, Byrne loves to talk about orchestration, but from an orchestration standpoint, there is a platform that is orchestrating what's going on the ground, as opposed to a sort of the tragedy of the commons where you may have people who are out there committing individual acts. And I think that is important context as we develop regulatory schemes in this space, just to make sure that you're not necessarily creating imperfect fits and then having to revisit regulations in the future. But the second piece of this is over the last, I think this is bigger than sort of like robotic deployment, but over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen this process through which a lot of technology companies have sort of deployed without consultation to a world now where companies try and, you know, get out ahead of it. But I think from a municipal side and from a planning side, having programs that are able to move from pilots to commercial operations can be tremendously beneficial. I know there are a number of cities that have pilot programs, and you might not have any operators there, for example.
Mm, mm.
San Francisco is one of them. There are permits that are available to do robotic deployment, but there's no pathway to commercial operations. So for a lot of companies, they think, well, am I going to spend my resources doing a pilot largely like, is this a checkbox for the municipality? Is the planning staff actually going to learn anything from this, especially if we're unable to do commercial deliveries? And there isn't a pathway to actually make that process commercial. So from the business standpoint, it ends up being a little bit of a money suck. So I think having some process in place where you have some agreed upon benchmarks can be tremendously helpful here. So like you might create your sandbox and say, look, like this is what success looks like. And you could work with operators on figuring that out, but figuring out what those benchmarks are, meeting those benchmarks, and then deciding, okay, now we're ready for a commercial operation. Now we're ready to understand what regulations need to be in place to move forward. I think those are sort of two broad-based learnings that I feel like we've had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I deliberately sort of asked you the first question, Viggy, because John, I wanted to get you to sort of listen for a little bit. And as a planner, John, as a trained planner, you've worked in cities for a long, long time. What starts to come to mind for you now starting to digest, this sort of PMR agenda? What conversations are there that cities are yet to have around robotics? You deal with cities all over the world, and you deal with cities and innovation all over the world, smart infrastructure, smart technology. The robots have arrived, John. As an urban planner, talk to me about cities and from a planning perspective, what your views are around the conversations that haven't been happening that maybe should be happening.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And the surprising thing is that as I began to think about this, talked with a number of planners in different cities, and remarkably, it's just not on their radar. And, and the key thing there was in the conversations that I had with them is are you ready to accept them in your community? And I found that a lot of the intelligent communities, smart cities that the intelligent community deals with, they're the ones that are either dealing with the aspect of having governance around PMRs or have had a pilot, but yet it's still not on their radar. I think it's an important aspect to talk about. How do we engage them? how do we get them and the public to begin to understand the benefits that Vignesh talks about? Yes, there are benefits, but people just aren't aware of them. And in any planning endeavor, the first thing we try to do is to familiarize people with the topic at hand. And here is a topic that is in social media, of course. Maybe they met them in malls and airports and so forth in a variety of different ways. They've seen the Unitree agile robots dancing around, but have they actually had an experience of having a delivery? Not very many. Um, and so I've looked at the literature, and you have a wonderful white paper. I have to admit, it was really eye-opening for me. But the first thing I would do is to engage the public around familiarization. I also would like to ensure that people experience a pilot at some point and receive the kind of comments coming out of it. It really depends on the city as well. Uh, in the pictures that you have here, some of the streets have ample sidewalk widths. There's usually a number of zones, but every city that usually involves one of these hasn't really prepared for robots, but has a requirement for clearance, usually 2.5 to 3 meters of a pedestrian access way, and that's sufficient for somebody to go past in a wheelchair and so forth. But the space between the curb and that space that people walk along is usually filled with things like trees or rental positions for e-scooters or bikes and so forth. And then the issue of the curb itself. What I find is remarkable is that people have not really engaged in planning the sidewalk. It was surprising for me that the sidewalk is almost a leftover piece of planning that is the last frontier, as you referred to it. And I agree. So how do we go about the next steps? I think familiarization, doing a small pilot, getting the kind of dynamics around the community engagement, seeing that everybody has participated in co-designing that space, and all the spaces will be different. Urban centers that have very narrow street sidewalk opportunities versus some of the communities where there have been some very successful integrations, like in Markham, Ontario, but there they have wider sidewalks and you can actually allow that. But the city of Toronto, back in 2021, banned them. They banned them because of the experience that they've had with micro devices, e-scooter rentals, all those sorts of things. We need to understand what the actual product is and what it can do and how it can be useful in certain areas. There are terrific experiences that have been found in places like Boston and San Francisco. I know that in Seoul, Korea, they have them as well that have very successfully engaged PMRs to be part of their communities. And so a lot of our intelligent communities that we've come across have them. I just contacted Las Rosas de Madrid, where a pilot is underway right now, and and people are excited to experience them. But by and large, most planners that I've come across seriously do not have them on their radar yet. And that's a key area that we need to work on.
Yes, and this is the start of a movement, John. We're going to start that today. And let me bring in our audience. Thank you, John, for that response. I just want to bring in the audience. I've got a couple of questions here, folks. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a Menti poll here. So the hypothetical here that PMR pilot permit lands, it's happening. Which department should steward the project? If I'm to sort of just describe it as a project, the pilot. Hmm.
I'm going to confess I was one of the others, Adam. And for me, I would say there needs to be an innovation department. I know the city of Kingston, which is a top 21 or top, I'm not sure if it's top seven smart city or intelligent committee city, has an innovation and strategy department. And that's where I would see it starting, or
Okay.
at least some sort of collaboration between the departments.
Yeah. Okay. Viggy, what's your experience here, and how do you react to sort of the responses on the slide?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends. A lot of cities are structured differently depending on what the portfolio tends to look like. I think there are good reasons for many of these, right? Like we were talking about sidewalk widths and footpaths, and that's often a question that comes out of planning. On the data side, every delivery that a serve robot does removes a car off the public right of way. That's a question for transport and transportation. Sort of a wholesale design of the city promoting local commerce becomes a question for public works. And so, or economic development. And so it can sit in a lot of places. I will mention that responding to the idea of having sort of like a multi departmental or intergovernmental sort of agency that covers this, that can also be challenging. We've found that in San Francisco, for example, they call it the innovation front door, but it's basically the idea that there's an office that helps you shepherd through the various departments to get something done. One of the challenges there is some departments are designed to be fast and some are designed to be slow, and you end up with kind of the worst of all worlds, right? And oftentimes there may be different considerations that are coming in. I think, in our experience, transportation has tended to be the best place to go, largely because planning's response time on infrastructure development is quite long. They're very long lead times on much of that. The inputs that come in through transportation can help to spur some of the planning development along. And I think economic development, I think from like a business perspective can be great because they're always very helpful. Their goal is to try and help businesses thrive in a city, but I don't think that's where you're going to get the most sort of salient data in terms of how the city functions or how the program is going. In our experience, I think transportation tends to be the most logical place. And the sort of specific example of this that comes to mind is really Los Angeles, which I think they probably have the highest density of delivery robots in the world. We have, upwards of 600 there. We're not the only operator. Coco is also operating there, and I believe they probably have 200 to 300 as well. So I would assume that Los Angeles has between 800 and 900 robots that are operating within the city limits, and LADOT has been incredibly responsive. They've put in integrations with mobility data specifications so that they can receive fleet level data from all of the operators and digest that. And then we believe that information is then shared with the other departments, but like they tend to have the expertise in terms of fleet management generally.
Yeah, interesting. John, Lee's point in her opening statement there around sort of, sitting with innovation. In your experience with municipalities around the world, I mean, 9 out of 10 municipalities are generally structured the same way. It's always been that way. It's how we budget, how we make decisions. Is there anything coming potentially that you think PMRs challenge that sort of structure and mindset for good, maybe? What would you say to the response here?
Certainly, it's a factor that's going to force communities to be more collaborative around the discussions that different departments have. And whether you have a community that has a very strong transport division or planning division will also depend on the staffing capabilities and so forth. My sense is that usually the expertise of a planning department is supposed to be more of a comprehensive look at things. They are also trained to work with the public. Transport people aren't, public works people aren't. So planning should take the lead. However, it shouldn't necessarily be uniquely under planning. I think in the other category, the idea of some kind of a PMR coordinating committee through an innovation lens, I think is probably the best way to go. But service through a planning department that has dedicated staff who work with communities, collaboration, all those sorts of things. I know people in the City of Toronto's Development Review Committee, which was specifically designed to move along projects, particularly issues around housing and so forth. And they take their projects and bring together transportation, public works, economic development, all the different departments, and have to get that information to a decision maker, in this case,
Mm,
council. That's the process that it would take. It wouldn't be transport that would do that. It wouldn't be
mm,
public works. So
yeah.
my sense is around the world, if you have a planning department, that would be the first place to start, but it would probably evolve into a specialized group. By the way, we at ICF have found that a lot of the cities around the world are taking a public-private partnership route. They call it triple helix, or quadruple helix when you add the citizen to it. But it's, the private sector, government, institutions, particularly because there's a lot of new ideas, startups, and so forth come through there, and the citizen. And once
Mm,
you engage all of those groups and have a process where co-design can be possible from the beginning and a continuous improvement as you go along, that seems to be the best vehicle for moving this concept forward, particularly in areas where they haven't really experienced the PMR introduction yet.
yeah. Okay. John, Viggy, thanks for that. I want to move on to the next question. Let's sort of see what the room has to say about this one. The statement is we will deal with the robots when they arrive. Smart or reckless? Somewhere in between? Okay, that's interesting. That there's, oh, okay, right. Uh, Viggy, what are you thinking here when you sort of see something like this?
I think this makes sense. I think oftentimes most of the challenges that come up around PMRs are not, I don't, I think we don't see them as anomalous or solely germane to PMRs themselves. And I'll
Mm,
give really specific examples. I think oftentimes businesses have a tendency to make a business case, right? So it's the case that's usually made by most businesses once it's either consumer facing or it is investor facing. And we've seen this over the years with Uber, for example, whose sort of public message was not about labor displacement or arbitrage, but it was about convenience and ease of access. Airbnb's public message was about be like competition on cost and it's sort of custom experiences in different cities, but it wasn't necessarily about rents or what the downstream impact of the business might be. Same thing came up with electric scooters. The initial message was about last mile mobility, about removing cars and other vehicles from the road, and not about sidewalk clutter or about human behavior on sidewalks and the lack of sort of a behavioral codex for how you ought to behave. And I think the businesses we do ourselves a disservice when we come in like that because ultimately that puts cities, residents on the back foot, institutions, right? Everyone on the back foot a little bit because everyone's sitting there and saying, well, we don't know yet what the externality is. We've seen it. It's been 15, 20 years of this, and every time it's a little bit of like a nesting doll situation where once you're out there, you find out that, oh, this is what the downstream impact will be. So I think it behooves folks in the business community or within sort of the innovation ecosystem to be quite frank on the front end. What are the things you're trying to learn? Make sure that the city understands that and then has the appropriate guardrails in place to make sure that you're improving your performance over time. I think that creates a little bit more understanding between the residents of a community and government and what the operator might be facing, especially as you're looking at new municipalities. And I think like we can speak, candidly about an experience we had. We expanded into Chicago. It was our first. It's not that it doesn't snow in our other markets, but Chicago is like, blizzard conditions. You end up with sort of, more challenging situations that can arise. And we found that what we didn't know coming in was that the sidewalks were only cleared for the width of a single wheelchair. So even if you are someone who is disabled or using a mobility aid, you can't pass another person with a mobility aid in Chicago. That doesn't just affect us, it affects the entire mobility ecosystem. Because of that, when the robots would come up, here is a situation that's ripe for conflict with vulnerable sidewalk users. We spent a lot of time working to fix this. It actually in the early days, the city, they were receiving 311 responses. So when you call 311 and you leave a message that there is some infrastructure challenge or something that needs to be remedied, they were receiving those messages, but nothing was being relayed to us. And so we let the city know, listen, like in Los Angeles, we have a direct integration with 311. So when a 311 complaint comes in, it gets directly funneled to us and we remedy it immediately. And that helps to garner trust. It also helps us learn. I don't think any operator here is interested in increasing tensions with the communities we're trying to deploy in. So, using those learnings, having an open dialogue with CDOT really helped us get over the line there. We actually spent some time, we would send our staff. Like, oftentimes people don't realize that the operators have large numbers of people, who are locally hired, who maintain the robots, are calibrating sensors, but they also have periods where they're kind of waiting for the robots to come home. And we decided we'll deploy them and we will shovel those sidewalks to make sure that there's easier access. And they'll wear vests. It'll say that, look, like Serve is doing this as a broader service. As time's gone on, multiple wards in Chicago have allowed us to enter even after the initial period of conflict. And I think that's a testament to making sure you have a really, really good feedback loop and not trying to hoodwink the government that you're trying to work with. It's really crucial here as an operator that if you have you need to be candid about what you are trying to learn. And I mentioned earlier having shared benchmarks that you're working toward. And that can really go a long way to building that trust, getting you to where you need to be. When it comes to when I look at the responses here, I see it as somewhere in between, but I can understand the reckless response. I think especially because of the conflict that people have seen from multiple emerging technologies over the years. I think that tends to give people cold feet. And even getting back to John's example of sidewalk delivery robots and PMRs being banned in the city of Toronto, it really happened after Sidewalk Labs was kicked out of the city. And in that situation, the opposition, which included folks who might be members of the disabled or differently abled community, but also folks who are general tech skeptics, people who believe that anything that has a camera might be surveilling them. All of those groups had basically come out and said, like, we're in opposition to anything like this for the time being. And I think that now puts the onus on any operator that's trying to get going there to have to prove that that's not the case. What makes you different? And so, it's a challenge, but there's a huge opportunity here as well.
Thanks, Viggy. Before we jump on to the next question on the Menti, I wanted to throw an issue on the table that I happen upon quite frequently around rights and allocation of public space. And so I'm going to make sort of a statement. John, I'm going to ask you to kind of pile on and fill in any gaps or embellishments. And then I want to kind of circle back with you, Viggy. As an urban planner, I hang out with a lot of landscape architects and urban designers. They are the custodians of the public realm. That is what they were trained to do. It is people first. For decades, if not longer, we have been fighting for space for humans because these big tin cans that, roll down the road, they took over, way back. And when you look at the right of way, facade to facade, but the percentage of space that's less left for humans to walk and dine and interact and be social seems to be getting sort of smaller and smaller and smaller. So how dare you bring robots onto our footpaths and want to have a conversation that our cities should be ready for them? So that's my statement for the purpose of this exercise. John, Fill in any gaps for me or make any corrections, and then Viggy, I want you to react to that. I want us to have a sort of a good open dialogue around that. So, John, anything you would add to that statement I've made?
Well, as an urban designer as well, I've looked at the issues of space between and among buildings um, as a human right to be able to access these. Um, I think the area where this conversation is going has to harken back to Ignatius' comment about Toronto and Sidewalk Labs for those people who know what happened there. At the end of the day, it really came down to issues around privacy, but also trust and the issues of what is being designed from a human-centric perspective. So as urban designers look at space, they look at space in a broader context as a public right part. That's why it's called the public realm. And the opportunities for people in a democratized environment to have the right of access to those spaces is a priority. And cars, by mistake, have been given over that over, the last century. But there's now a fight, and in many cases, it's being won, where people through access as pedestrians as well as bikers and people to enjoy, marathons and other sorts of activities over the course of time on the streets. I contributed to a book called Streets for All, and that is really the basis around what this public realm should be for. Now, bringing in a PMR, you would think that people will probably react in the same way. It's just a smaller version of a mechanical device. In this case, it might be autonomous, but also you have autonomous vehicles on streets, and people are beginning to recognize their value. And I go back to that question of can we decide what is deemed value? And when we are able to say, yes, there's value here, we'll make space for it. I think people have found bike rentals of value. So they accept them on the sidewalks and in their streets. And they actually relish the fact that people are using them throughout the city. When you rent it, you get the, visitors visiting different places. So what's the value of the PMR in this particular case? If we can discover that, people will be much more aligned to welcoming them on the sidewalks. There are also design features that urban designers can come up with. I look at new cities' sidewalks with tactile surfaces for the blind. And that's a visual cue to accepting a blind person's movement in that space. The same thing can happen when an urban designer, landscape architect, designs a space that allows for robots to across them. And if you have a vehicle like, a painted surface that identifies that this is where PMRs are going to be, even though they're not there right now, instinctively through that cue that that is a place where a PMR can eventually come and you'll be having an experience with them. And maybe not
Mm,
a negative experience at all because you'll discover that there's value there. So it's
mm,
issues of trust, just like the issues of privacy can come back to haunt you later on. Issues of how to deal with accepting a new entry like a
mm.
PMR into your space is an important way of making this happen.
Yeah, thanks, John. Our chat box is lighting up a bit here. So Vicky, I'm going to get you to. We'll respond to that, and then we'll head to the questions. I mean, you must get sort of this issue or this narrative come up from time to time. I actually think it's a really exciting one. I think, and I just kind of posted about it last week, and it was an aha moment for me because in Australia we're about to have our first pilot of PMRs in the country. And it's in sort of my own backyard. So I'm actually really excited. And I think it's going to be the circuit breaker for this bigger conversation around the allocation of space in the right of way, because to date, I felt it's been pedestrians and cyclists versus the big tin cans, the big cars, right? And it's been us versus them, and that they've got more space than we have. That's not equitable. It's not democracy, so on and so forth. And of course, now this little thing that starts to sort of come into the conversation, which is, well, it's not a car. It's not a pedestrian. It kind of moves at pedestrian pace. It's quiet. It's sort of, it really gets you to think. And I think it's going to jolt many of us to have this really interesting dialogue around the public realm and allocation of space to what. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think and it reminds me of a parallel conversation that's been happening recently in sort of the housing development world. I'm thinking about sort of the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard folks who sort of historically have dealt with a very sort of similar dynamic around a supply constraint around housing. And what that's done for folks who currently have housing who feel like, ooh, like if there's more housing that's built, what's that going to do to my home values or my neighborhood character? Versus what does it mean for, cost of housing if it's limited? And, in this instance, I think, I agree with the premise entirely that cities are becoming more atomized. There's in many ways we subsidize long haul delivery. I think I would assume that every single person that is on this call over the course of the last month has bought something online. And that item did not come from their neighborhood store. It was either on a cargo ship 2 days before, or it came from a warehouse that was on the outskirts of the city and was funneled in on a box truck or a large vehicle. Oftentimes, it is much cheaper to purchase things that way. It costs you $2 to get something from China and $8 to get it from Chinatown. Why is that? And it's largely because we have automation at the ports. We have automation in warehouses. Things are right-sized. When you think about goods that are moved across borders, they are coming on in a box on a ship. The box is then transferred to a train, then it goes onto a truck, then it goes into a facility where most of these are sort of automated supply chains at this point, or is then moved to a smaller vehicle before it reaches your doorstep. What that's done essentially meant that anytime, let's say I need to go get a toolbox and I'm doing some household chores, there's an Ace Hardware up the street from me. But everyone loves the convenience and the price advantage of purchasing something that shows up to their doorstep and the time that's saved. And what that's done is it's also threatened the livelihoods of our local businesses. I think everyone can think about streets in your city where there used to be a vibrant block of businesses that have struggled. And when you ask them, they will tell you that they're struggling. Even restaurants will say, we're struggling because of the cost of delivery. Businesses will say, we are struggling because big box retail online is able to outcompete us. There was really only sort of two ways to combat this, right? Like one way to combat it is to simply say we're going to eliminate e-commerce as a thing. We're going to put the cat back in the bag, which is a really lofty goal. But the other way is to make it cheaper to buy locally. And this is one of those, and have less friction when you're buying locally. And we really see PMRs as an opportunity to do that, but it's not just that, right? Like in addition to it being able to reduce the cost to be able to spend your dollar locally. The other sort of advantage here is vehicles are getting larger year over year, and there are more of them moving more goods through our cities. A burrito should not be sitting in the back of a Ford F-150 coming to your home. And, as a resident, you think about, I have two young kids. How do I feel about those large vehicles speeding through my neighborhood? The driver is staring at their phone, thinking about how they need to do their first drop and then do their second drop, then go and double park at the next business, then go to the next location. That is a constraint and a stressor that is felt by cities acutely. And I think it's a real challenge for planners on how to combat this because some of these forces are bigger than the cities themselves. ultimately, when a city looks at this, I know there was actually a question in the chat box about whether it's proven that cars are removed from these trips. And I think a point I want to make is if you are purchasing locally, then that good isn't being delivered in the box truck. Or, in addition, when it comes to Serve, for example, we have direct integrations with like DoorDash, for example. Every time you order on DoorDash, if there is a robot available, a robot will do the trip. If a robot is doing the trip, depending on the city, New York, of course, has tons of cyclists, e-bike riders. Los Angeles doesn't. Los Angeles is filled with cars. And so every trip that we do in Los Angeles is removing a car from the public right of way. So those, about 600 robots that are operating in the city of LA, every trip they do removes a car trip. And so when we think about that ecosystem, being able to measure those safety benefits, being able to measure what the economic impact is locally downstream can be tremendously helpful as planners try and think about how we respond to this. And then getting back to sort of the first point about like the conversation around housing development is it is absolutely true that there isn't enough sidewalk space. It's absolutely true that we already subsidize car parking in many cities. And when you think about how to utilize that limited space, oftentimes I think for a planner, you don't want to go up against a suburban driver who's coming in and is trying to work, or someone who's trying to, there's everyone still drives for better or for worse. But finding ways to expand sidewalk space can go a really, really long way in making sure that cities are more livable. And not just and it's not just because people need access to those spaces, but it also reduces the amount of conflict broadly. And it's not just with vehicles, it can be with other individuals. The thing is, anytime there's conflict with other individuals, the way that tends to be logged is that was a bad driver, that was a rude person. It's not read as this was planned poorly. And so I'll give a really specific example of this. In West Hollywood, there's an intersection where we were having a number of close calls. There would be cars that would be making sort of this, it's like a blind left turn. And we started logging them. We said, oh my goodness, like every time we cross this street, there is, a 40% likelihood of having a close call with a car that's traveling at 40 miles per hour. If we're experiencing that, pedestrians are undoubtedly experiencing that. But when a pedestrian reaches out to the city, they hear that as an anecdote. They don't hear it as a data point. They don't know the extent to which that is occurring. So we're able to share that data back out to the city, and hopefully the city can also become more responsive over time because it can actually let you know what the movement patterns are, not just of the robots, but of people, of conflict with vehicles, and with pickup and loading zones, and help them in terms of curb allocation and curb modernization as well.
Vicky, thanks for that. And yeah, data and PMRs, that's a whole other webinar, Lee, that we have to get on the agenda at some point. This chat box is lighting up, so I've binned the Mentimeter. Even though I had some questions I wanted to ask, there's some great stuff in here. So let's do a rapid fly through here. Mark asks a really interesting question around privately owned robots, and of course, I don't know what's happened overseas, but in Australia, the privately owned e-scooter thing has happened, and it's gone for a while, and it's been a nightmare for regulators. The importation of private e-scooters and the speeds they can go, and anyway, that's been a whole other sort of turmoil that we've had to go through. Won't dig into that, Mark, but that is a really interesting one that I think is certainly something on the horizon that we may need to think about. Lindsay has said state law in Pennsylvania allowed PMRs and AVs to deploy with limited local control. How can cities ensure they still have a meaningful voice in how these technologies are deployed? There has been a lot of conflict in Philly. Is there a soundbite response?
Yeah, this is actually very, very aligned. Both questions are actually aligned with the regulatory guidebook that we're trying to publish. So there's the whole issue of sort of urban planning, but then there's also not just regulation, but then also enforcement. So as you say, like there are cities where, privately owned scooters or maybe, follow me robots or things like that are prohibited, but there's no way to enforce it, right? So in Denmark, for example, robots, were, previously not allowed, but people started getting these self-driving lawnmowers and it was just impossible for them to enforce. So
Mm,
they just kind of, like, oh my goodness, they ended up last summer, redesigning their regulations to align with the reality of their populace, right? So I think that
yeah.
that's something that needs to be addressed, not necessarily in urban planning, Lindsay, but related to regulation and enforcement, which is part of the standards that we're working on at the URF.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Lee. Corey's put a good question here around centralized coordination and monitoring of the operations. Viggy has put a response in there. Corey, I don't know if you're anywhere near a city that where Serve has deployed. I've been to two of them. Serve have been very welcoming. I've been to the depots. I've met with staff. I've sort of seen the single pane of glass, so to speak. And one of the best experiences is actually talking to the staff and where they've come from, how they got into that line of business. And there have been some incredible stories, like um, delivery drivers following the robot back to the Serve Robotics depot and asking for a job to work with Serve. And now he's running the West Hollywood one. There's some fantastic stories there. So
I
let's
think there's
keep,
also a bit here, Adam, related to the work that Bern is doing with Pudo City. So it's not just having a single pane of glass for one fleet operator, but
yes,
orchestration across multiple fleets, right? So if you've got a
yeah.
city like West Hollywood where there's Coco and, Serve in the same market, or, when it comes to like Waymo and, Baidu or whatever. I don't know, Bern, if you wanted to add anything else.
Multi-agent orchestration is what's really important. So a lot of cities have only one robot operator, and so that problem is not nearly as it's no worse than has already been described, which is bad enough. But when you have multiple operators, it's clearly much worse. I think, Vicky, you know many stories. I've heard at least a couple of them from you a couple of years ago of two robots from two different companies arriving at an intersection at the same time with different behaviors and different and there's been some fallout for that. I don't know if you're able to talk to those, but those are revealing about why we need multi-agent orchestration.
Yeah, the thing I want to mention about this is some of these, it's been challenging because there's a you're trying to tread this balance between predictability and the agility to find the best solution. If we get sort of boxed into something that is an imperfect solution, it can sort of bait the same sort of reactions that people get already. Simultaneously, it is really important to have sort of a shared understanding of behaviors. And I think on this, Milton Keynes was brought up in the chat, but some of the work that's being done on the RoboPass program, as well as the way that Japan also regulates PMRs with it. They also use John was talking about the sort of tripartite sort of like system where like you have institutions, regulators, the operator, and then of course there's sort of like the fourth sort of pillar, which is the residents. And in many of those systems, there is an ongoing conversation about what is the preferred behavior. An example of this is, do you pass on the right or pass on the left? If you're in Australia, the US, the UK, Japan, there are different habits. In some places, the habit is different. The driving habit will be one, and the walking habit is another. I know in the UK, there is a pass on the right culture, but unless you're on an escalator, I believe, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think having that sort of regulatory system in place helps to get operators on the same page because like I think one of the challenges here is like every operator is going to seek their sort of preference, right? That's where the business incentive sits. So I think it's incumbent on the regulators to have and sort of whatever the permitting process is to have a guidance on what is the preferred behavior in a specific instance.
I want to say we heard earlier in this conversation that this is from John that this is not even on the regulators' future map. They're not even considering these things, but you're pointing out that very critically we need these regulations. So I don't know how do we break that logjam? I don't know, John, if you have some ideas about that, but it's a very critical problem, and we've been working on it for almost 7 years now, and there's just almost no crack in the wall of getting
Well,
regulators.
it's interesting, Bern, that you've raised this. I've just raised it within the intelligent community and asked them why we haven't really done a lot of work around this. We have partnered with you to begin to get that message out. And this is my first interaction with you, other than when we met in Fredericton and so forth. But the issue that's out there is a key issue of conversation once you get going. This is a very complicated, very dynamic discussion. And when I've raised it with other planners, the conversation got quite quite interesting. And I'm sure that by raising this, by having, you know, a petting zoo environment where you can bring out all of the types of robots that are possible, and have them at malls, and particularly in public spaces as much as you can. It's something that maybe some of the companies like Serve and others are already doing, but I haven't come across it. And I'm in a lot of different cities, and this conversation just hasn't happened. Now that I will be going to other cities, and I've already circulated it we have over 220 cities that we deal with. Um, and many of them, interestingly enough, when I've looked at the data, many of them are involved in this conversation, but we haven't come across it. So now we are going to be engaging that conversation with every community that we're assessing. It'll become, I'm hoping, part of our factors to discuss along with AI and so forth. But you'll see more of this coming forward.
That's
Yeah.
very
Thanks.
good.
Thanks, John. There's 3 minutes to go. There is a question I wanted to sort of finally ask, and it's picking up on Corey's point here around financially constrained municipalities, assets, rights of way, forms of access. How can the city view this as more than just delivering a burrito, right, to number 74? How does this become a greater opportunity? And I think economic development is kind of the key there. And I know that on the Gold Coast, where the first deployment is going to be happening in Australia, it's not about delivering burritos. It is about a mayor that has a vision for a city and innovation being a key pillar of investment attraction. Viggy, a soundbite from you. Um, I think sometimes we often get lost and we focus on the six-wheeler on the sidewalk and the video that was posted on LinkedIn showing some, chaotic moment in time. There's kind of a bigger picture here from a municipality perspective. What might be one or two big things that maybe we're losing sight of that could be a real opportunity to engage?
Whew, it's you're ending on a really big
I
question.
know, I know, and we've run out of time, but like
Yeah,
it's more than just the burrito in the six-wheeler, right? Going to number
it, it
74.
it is. I think at the end of the day, like goods and people move through cities already. I think, one of the cities make choices every day in terms of the way space is allocated, and none of these are frozen in time, nor should they be. You can find that a specific urban design is not serving you anymore as time goes on because you can see it. The businesses are struggling. There's less foot traffic. What does that mean? And oftentimes, what we found is that cities that are rapidly growing or have less of an entrenched sort of like belief about like a bygone culture tend to be a little bit more willing to try things. And I think like some really good examples of this are that like Milton Keynes is, I'm going to mention them again. They're a newer planned city, so I think like they seem to be pretty open. Then you'll have like a city like Detroit, who are looking for investment, or looking for ways to keep the city vibrant. Those considerations are dramatically different from a San Francisco or a Boston, where you might not feel the impact so acutely, or there's people have an idea in their heads of what the city ought to look like. Um, I think what's most sort of important here is to have some sort of framework that can help cities be more agile. This stuff it's not that delivery robots, okay, and then you do it and then that's it, right? I think candidly, we don't know what the future applications look like. Right now, serve robots are doing laundry service in Los Angeles. We pick up someone's dry cleaning, we take it to a wash and fold, and then return it to the person. You can very easily imagine a world where a robot is bringing you something from a retailer near you, and you don't know what size fits you. You try on three different sizes, and you put two back in the bin, and it goes right back to the business. The business likes it because their item is back on the shelf, and you like it because you don't need to go to the post office and return the thing. But that's, I think, sort of the key here. That post office trip is still a car trip.
Mm.
When it's very, I think oftentimes when people see the robot, they're like, there's a robot that's doing a thing, and that's on top of everything else that's going on. But that's not exactly the case. Like in most of these instances, what you're seeing is that um, there's sort of a change in behavior, kind of across the board, or at the margins, and then as time goes on and sort of more modalities come into place, you're going to see some of these systems change. There's no reason why we shouldn't see more hub and spoke models. We did a pilot project with the drone delivery service wing, where the robot did the pickup at the restaurant, dropped it off to a drone then took it to someone's home. And the reason that was important is I don't think any business wants six drones waiting outside of their business, whereas a robot is a lot less intrusive. So it was a really successful sort of use case of, hey, look, like we can actually, this isn't just a short trip. This can actually like eliminate kind of a long car trip and help get things, move things more effectively over to you. So I think like thinking about this holistically, we don't know what the next technology is going to be. We don't know what's to come, and having some system in place that cities can respond and develop in a more agile way can actually really help not just operators, but the city itself grow.
Biggie, thank you for that response. It was a big question right at the end. I want to thank John and Viggy. Thank you, guests. Lee, over to you for a final close.
Thank you so much, everybody. Also, I just wanted to give John a chance. Is there a final remark that you wanted to make? Just because.
Just, I think 2 points very quickly. One is that the world needs really great examples. So what we do at ICF is showcase best practices and urban solutions. And this is one of them that will need best practices so that you can go and we can go out and tell the world that this is what they need. The second thing is from an economic development point of view, showcasing your community as agile, very accepting of new innovation, having them successfully deployed, having governance that does the right thing to support them and enforce them and so forth. These are things that will be attractive to attract not only investment, but also the talent that cities need to be able to do this in. And so as an economic developer, people should also look at this as a competitive advantage for their community to consider.
Thank you so much. All right, great, everybody. Thank you so much. We'll talk again on August 19th and 20th. We have Adam talking on the same subject with two speakers in the Australia Pacific time zone. And then on October 1st, stay tuned for our webinar on robotaxis and how that impacts public spaces and planning for that. So we will be back. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.